It was the morning of May 6, 1950, and Elizabeth Taylor was 19 years old, sitting alone in the most expensive hotel suite in Paris, crying so hard she could barely breathe. Outside the window, the Eiffel Tower was visible in the early light. Inside, the wedding dress she had worn 4 days ago was still hanging on the back of the door, 42 yards of white satin that MGM had paid for, that 6 seamstresses had spent 3 weeks building, that every newspaper in America had called the most beautiful bridal gown in Hollywood history. Her husband of 4 days, Conrad Hilton Jr., heir to a hotel empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was not in the room. He had not been in the room for most of the honeymoon. And Elizabeth Taylor, the girl whose violet eyes had made grown men forget their own names, was beginning to understand something that no one had warned her about. Not her mother, not her studio, not the MGM executives who had approved the marriage like a business transaction and sent a photographer to document the ceremony. What she was learning in that Paris hotel suite would take her 9 months to fully accept. But once she accepted it, it would change everything, not just about who she married next, but about who she decided to become. This is the story of the 9 months that created Elizabeth Taylor. If you want to understand why this story matters beyond gossip and beyond the Hollywood mythology that tends to swallow everything whole, you need to stay until the end of this video, because what happened between Elizabeth Taylor and Conrad Hilton Jr. in 1950 did not simply end in a divorce filing. It ended with a decision, and that decision quietly shaped every contract she negotiated, every battle she picked with MGM, and every relationship she entered afterward with her eyes deliberately, permanently open. Most people know the headlines. Very few people know what was actually happening behind them. And before we go any further, if you are not yet subscribed, do it now, because this channel goes places that the official histories do not. To understand what Elizabeth Taylor was walking into when she married Conrad Hilton Jr., you have to understand what she was walking out of. She had been signed by Universal Pictures at 9 years old and by MGM at 12, and the studio system that produced her was, by any modern standard, a machine of total control. MGM decided which interviews she gave, which events she attended, and in documented cases which personal relationships were acceptable and which were not. Her mother Sarah Taylor was present at virtually every professional engagement of Elizabeth's early career. There were no boundaries between Elizabeth's public self and her private self because MGM had never allowed a private self to exist. She was, by her own later admission, an asset before she was a person. By 1949, she was 17 years old and one of the most photographed human beings on Earth, and she had also, behind those violet eyes and that carefully maintained smile, begun to form something that neither Sarah Taylor nor MGM had anticipated. She was beginning to form a will of her own. And wills, once formed, tend to go looking for the first available door. Conrad Hilton Jr., known to everyone who moved in his orbit as Nicky, was 23 years old when he encountered Elizabeth Taylor at a social gathering in the autumn of 1949. He was charming in the way that men raised in unbroken luxury sometimes are, with an ease that reads as warmth until you spend enough time with it to see that it is not warmth exactly but the practiced confidence of someone who has never been told no by the world in any meaningful way. He drank heavily, he gambled, but when he met Elizabeth Taylor, he focused on her with an attentiveness that was, in those first weeks, genuinely striking. For Elizabeth, who had spent her entire conscious life being told what to do and where to stand and how to feel, the interest of a man who seemed to be choosing her rather than casting her was intoxicating in a way she had not prepared for. By November of 1949, they were engaged. The announcement moved through the press like an electrical current. And Elizabeth Taylor wore the engagement ring to the father of the bride press junket and smiled for photographs with the brightness of someone who is genuinely happy and also, somewhere beneath the happiness, quietly afraid, though she could not yet have said of what. The wedding took place on May 6, 1950, at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills. 300 guests attended. The dress, designed by Helen Rose, MGM's chief costume designer, received newspaper coverage that bordered on devotion. Helen Rose would later say that building it was one of the most technically complex things she had ever undertaken, and the photographs confirm this. Elizabeth Taylor at 19, standing in 42 yards of white satin with her dark hair and those impossible eyes, was the precise image of everything that post-war American culture had decided a young woman's life should be moving toward. What the cameras did not capture was the conversation that reportedly took place approximately 40 minutes before the ceremony, when a member of MGM's publicity department reminded Elizabeth, in the careful language of studio employees who understood their own job security, that the studio had invested considerably in this wedding and that a visible, stable marriage would serve her career in ways that the alternative would not. Elizabeth Taylor, who was 19 years old and had grown up inside this machinery, understood exactly what was being communicated. She walked down the aisle 37 minutes later. The honeymoon began in Europe, and by the third day a pattern had established itself that would persist for the remaining 9 months of the marriage. Conrad drank, he gambled, he kept company with men who had no requirement of him beyond the ability to keep up, and Elizabeth would sit in suites that his family's name had built, in rooms that cost more per night than most Americans earned in a month, and wait for a husband who was somewhere in the warm European evening with people who made no demands on him whatsoever. There are accounts from people who were peripherally present during those weeks, hotel staff, acquaintances passing through the same cities, that paint a consistent picture. Elizabeth Taylor in the early mornings, alone, not going to the restaurant because going alone meant the photographers would notice, and once the photographers noticed it would be in the papers, and once it was in the papers MGM would call. So she stayed, and she thought, and what she had understood only intellectually about the shape of her marriage was beginning to take on the physical weight of daily reality. The wedding dress on the back of the door was not just a symbol of a struggling marriage. It was beginning to feel like a symbol of a self that had been built by other people and was now, in a room where no one was directing her to be anything in particular, starting to feel like a costume she had not chosen. They returned to the United States in late May, and the public version of the story continued to run on schedule. Elizabeth gave warm, non-specific interviews. Conrad appeared at her side at events that required his presence. On the outside, everything was proceeding as a Hollywood marriage of that era was supposed to proceed. On the inside, Elizabeth Taylor was working on a film called A Place in the Sun, directed by George Stevens, and something was happening on that set that most accounts of the Hilton marriage tend to overlook entirely. Stevens was not like the directors Elizabeth had worked with before at MGM. He was meticulous and slow and interested in performance in a way that required his actors to go somewhere real rather than somewhere rehearsed. On that set, for the first time in her professional life, Elizabeth was being treated as an adult artist rather than a studio asset, and the experience was, first, disorienting, and then revelatory. She also formed, on that set, the friendship with Montgomery Clift that would become one of the defining relationships of her life. Clift was 29, brilliant, capable of an emotional honesty that was almost entirely foreign to the world Elizabeth had been raised in. He talked to her about her own talent as if her interior life mattered. This was not something Elizabeth Taylor had extensive experience with, and in the context of a marriage where her interior life was, by all available evidence, of very little interest to her husband, the contrast had the quality of something clarifying at a speed she was not fully prepared for. By the end of 1950, the legal machinery of the divorce was quietly in motion. The official grounds in the California filing were mental cruelty, which was in that era the standard language for a wide range of marital failures that the court system did not require to be examined in detail. The gossip columns were predictably ungenerous toward Elizabeth, because gossip columns of that period tended toward unkindness regarding young women who failed at marriage, and because there were people connected to the Hilton family with an interest in ensuring that Conrad Jr.'s behavior during those 9 months was not the version of events that achieved public prominence. The narrative that took hold in certain corners of the press was that Elizabeth Taylor was too young, too ambitious, too Hollywood to sustain a real marriage. This version required no specific facts to support it, which was convenient, because the specific facts pointed in a different direction. Multiple people who were present in their lives during that period have provided, over the years, consistent accounts of a marriage in which the primary problems were Conrad's drinking, his gambling, his extended absences, and on several documented occasions of volatility in his behavior toward Elizabeth that went considerably beyond anything the word difficult adequately described. Here is the part of the story that does not appear in official accounts. Sometime in the autumn of 1950, during the weeks when the legal process of ending the marriage was already underway, Elizabeth Taylor made a decision about her own life that was so fundamental that it is impossible to understand anything she did afterward without understanding it first. She decided that she would never again allow the structure of her life to be determined by other people's plans for her. Not MGM's plans, not her mother's plans, not a husband's expectations. She would make her own choices, make them fully and without apology, and live with their consequences rather than live with the consequences of decisions that other people had made on her behalf. This sounds, stated simply, like an obvious thing. But in the context of 1950 Hollywood, for a young woman under contract to the most powerful studio in the world, surrounded by people whose entire professional function was to manage her decisions before she had the chance to make them, it was not obvious at all. It was, in fact, a declaration of war against the entire system that had produced her, and she made it quietly, without ceremony, in a year when no one was watching closely enough to notice. The evidence for this decision is not a single dramatic statement. It is the entire shape of the career and the life that followed. Elizabeth Taylor in 1952 began pushing back against MGM's casting choices in ways her contract technically did not permit, accepting the suspensions the studio handed down as the cost of the right to refuse. Elizabeth Taylor in 1957 negotiated profit participation in her own work at a level no female star of that era had previously achieved. And Elizabeth Taylor in 1963, negotiating Cleopatra, became the first actress in history to receive a $1 million salary for a single film, a number so large it briefly destabilized the financial projections of an entire studio. None of this happened simply because she was talented. It happened because a 19-year-old girl in Paris understood something in the silence of an empty suite that she could not have understood any other way. Elizabeth Taylor married 7 more times after Conrad Hilton Jr. She married Michael Wilding in 1952, Mike Todd in 1957, Eddie Fisher in 1959, Richard Burton in 1964, Richard Burton again in 1975, John Warner in 1976, and Larry Fertenska in 1991. Not all of these choices were wise. Not all of them ended without damage. Several of them ended with a degree of public spectacle that would have permanently destroyed a lesser person's ability to continue working at the level she worked at. But each of them was, in the most important sense, hers. She chose. She chose badly sometimes. She chose with her whole self, always, and she refused consistently and at real professional cost to allow anyone to rewrite her choices as errors rather than decisions. The friendship with Montgomery Clift that began in 1950 lasted until his death in 1966 and was, by all available testimony, one of the most genuinely sustaining relationships of her life. When Clift was critically injured in the car accident on Coldwater Canyon Drive in May of 1956, Elizabeth Taylor was the first person to reach him, pulling him from the wreckage and clearing his throat in the moments after impact, and the actions she took in those immediate minutes, refusing to leave until she was certain he would be transported safely, were not the actions of a woman managing her public image. They were the actions of a person who had decided, somewhere around 1950, that the people she loved mattered more than how she looked while loving them. And in 1985, when Rock Hudson was dying and the AIDS crisis was a subject that major celebrities treated as professionally radioactive, Elizabeth Taylor became the most prominent public figure in America to attach herself to the cause without hesitation, CO founding AMFAR, the Foundation for AIDS Research, and raising money and attention at a time when most of her contemporaries were carefully looking away. Not because a publicist suggested it, not because the demographics aligned, because her friend was dying and she had long since decided that no version of safety was worth the smallness it required. The wedding dress that hung on the back of the door in that Paris hotel suite in May of 1950 was eventually packed and returned to Los Angeles, where it was displayed for a time in the MGM Costume Archive. Visitors could look at it and think about the wedding it had been worn to and the marriage that followed. What almost no visitor was thinking about was the girl who had sat in the hotel room behind that door, alone in the early morning light, crying in a way that was not a performance because there was no one present to perform for. That girl was learning something. She was learning it in the only way that certain essential things can be learned, which is alone, and without any guarantee that the understanding you are working your way toward will ultimately justify what you are paying to reach it. Elizabeth Taylor was 19 years old and she was paying. And what she received in return, eventually, was the thing that made her Elizabeth Taylor rather than simply the girl in the photograph. She got the knowledge of her own will. She got the understanding that she was not a dress, not a contract, not a studio asset, not a wife in the particular obedient sense that the word had been offered to her in that Beverly Hills church. She was a person, and persons, she had decided, got to choose. The 9 months of her marriage to Conrad Hilton Jr. were not formative in a dramatic or singular way. They were formative in the quieter and more durable way that certain experiences tend to be, which is that they clarified something already true and gave it a weight that made it impossible, from that point forward, to pretend otherwise. She already had a will. She had always had a will. The marriage gave her the occasion to find it in the silence of a room where no one was telling her what to feel. And that discovery, made alone in an expensive suite in Paris at 19 years old, turned out to be the most valuable thing she carried out of the briefest and in certain respects the most consequential chapter of a genuinely extraordinary life. If this story changed the way you see her, share it with someone who thinks they already know everything about Elizabeth Taylor. Because they do not, and neither, until today, did you.